Our next conversation will focus on how the U.S. can continue to lead and push the frontier of AI. We are thrilled to welcome the Honorable Sasha N. Baker, Senior Advisor for National Security Policy at OpenAI, Keith Stryer, Senior Vice President at AMD, Dr. Chris Miller, author of Chip War and Senior Advisor to the Special Competitive Studies Project, and moderator Gene Meserve, host of SCSP's NatSec Tech podcast.
Well, hi. So I think artificial intelligence has been mentioned in absolutely every session that you guys have been part of here today. We're going to dig in a little deeper, go a little broader, and talk about it some more. I want to start with the question of the competition, because that's come up a lot today, usually framed as the US versus China when it comes to AI. Chris, you wrote a book called Chip Wars. So give me your assessment. Who's winning in this competition right now?
Well, I think you can measure chip competition, which is related but distinct from measuring AI competition. And in either one of those segments, there's probably 1,000 different variables one could look at. I think if you ask yourself, would you rather be in the position of the US or China when it comes to chips? The answer is pretty obvious. It's so obvious that China is repeatedly violating export controls to try to get access to the US chip ecosystem. And I think in the chip space, so long as we have regular news stories of people in China going to Singapore, putting GPUs in their suitcase, and then flying to China, I think that's a pretty solid data point on which ecosystem you'd rather have access to.
Okay, so that's chips specifically. Talk to me about AI more broadly.
Well, in the last couple of years, I think, have shown pretty conclusively that there's a relationship between the computing power you have access to and the type of AI system you can train. Now, that's not true for every single type of AI system, but if you look at the big AI companies today, their view is that bigger is better. The scaling laws is what they call it. And so long as that dynamic holds, so long as bigger is better, then access to computing power will be one of the gating factors that will determine who can train the biggest AI systems.
So Keith, is it just US, China, or is there more to this competition? Yes, I am.
Me.
Yes, I am.
It's late in the day. I hope everyone's had a little caffeine in between the sessions because we're going on and on. I hope you guys are doing okay.
It's up to you to.
It's up to us to keep it interesting. Yeah, she's goading me because we met this morning to talk about this, and I unloaded on her how much I really don't like to frame it up as such an oversimplified two-horse race. It perhaps geopolitically is. I'll let others decide. I think it actually is a much more complex conversation, and it's easy and if not helpful, depending on where you sit on, in this country, to characterize it as us versus them. But actually, it's not just a race, right? And I think it's not helpful to think about that in two reasons. First of all, it's not just about two countries. Now, chips. That's a little bit easier because we know that chips are primarily designed in a few countries and primarily made in even fewer countries. So that's a little bit more straightforward. But AI, regulating AI is like regulating math, right? I mean, this is available everywhere. And while it's true, the biggest computers, the biggest computing capability is a gating factor for training foundation models, it's less of a factor for fine-tuning them. And since Meta and others are dropping, I don't know, I think there's 1 million open source models now on GitHub. And as far as I know, anyone can download from GitHub, including China and other countries. We've made those foundation models available. And so now the question is, what are they doing with them? The race is happening, I suppose, not just between the biggest countries. It's happening between every country, and it's happening within countries. People are racing against themselves to take advantage of this technology and to harness it to advance science and their economy and other things within their country. And so it's not just an us versus them thing.
So if it isn't just US and China, who else are the big players as you see it?
I don't know that. Look, I mean, Canada's not a big country in terms of population, right? I don't know, is it like 10% the size of the United States? But it's a big player.
It's about to get bigger, I think.
Yeah,
after
okay,
next Tuesday,
potentially. But in the fourth industrial revolution, where AI is one of the most important levers, the size of your country, all of these things that were important, that the classical definitions of power, the things that drove the third industrial revolution, are not as relevant here, right? So small countries, very small countries, countries like Estonia and Malta and Vietnam and other tiny countries, they can punch far above their weight in AI without having huge factories and billions of people. So I don't know about bigger countries. I think innovation is going to be, there'll be a lot of winners, let me put it that way.
Sasha, having been in government, I want to ask you, from your perspective, how important is it that the U.S. lead in AI? What's at stake here?
Yeah, look, I think it's tremendously important, and you know, I was at a different conversation very recently where someone said to me, so I agree, Chris, sort of fundamentally with your premise, better to be us than to be the PRC in this moment. I was at this conference recently, though, where someone said something that's really stuck with me, which is we may be the first ones to get to, let's say, AGI, artificial general intelligence, but we may not be the first country to really figure out how to implement it and integrate it into our processes, whether that's for economic opportunity, for national security purposes, et cetera. We, and you know, I think this has been a topic of conversation in this room and with this group, we don't tend to be early adopters, and we don't tend to get things into our ecosystem fast enough. And so you could win the race and still sort of lose the overall competition in that way.
Do you think we're at risk of doing that?
Absolutely. And I think it's along a couple of dimensions. I think first, I am concerned, and I think maybe we can talk about this in this panel, that we are not doing enough to invest in the infrastructure that's going to be required to really do AI at scale and really maximize the benefits. And the second is, I think we have not yet figured out how to really penetrate that membrane between what is happening in these frontier labs, like the one that I now work in, and what is happening inside the government, and how to really have that partnership and communication in a robust way.
I promise we're going to get to infrastructure.
One anecdote, just to back up something she was saying, right? The first country in the world to have a fully dedicated, full-time chief AI officer in every government agency was the United Arab Emirates, right? That's the first country to have that, right? And they're meeting on a regular basis now. All the CIOs of all the agencies get together. They have their goal, their benchmark. They're required to achieve certain goals. We're working towards that. I mean, it's not like that's not happening, but it hasn't happened here.
So, Sasha, there was a national security memorandum on AI just issued. Love your impressions of that.
Yeah.
Is it important, and what are its shortcomings?
Yeah. Look, I think it's a really important first step, and there's a lot to like in that national security memorandum. I think a couple things from my perspective, both as someone who's been in on the government side and now out on the industry side. I love the commitment to the United States being in the lead on AI, and just the explicit sort of statement that that is a goal and objective of the US government. I think that's incredibly important. I think you heard Jake Sullivan foot stomp that in his speech that he gave announcing the National Security Memorandum. I really like, I mean, you know, this is my bias coming from a background spending a lot of time at the Pentagon, but I really like the commitment to using AI for advancing our national security mission as a country. And again, saying that very clearly and stating that that's the direction of travel that the White House wants the government to move in. And then the third piece that I think is really good there, but where I think there's more work that needs to be done and the cement is still a little bit wet, is the commitment to international governance and to the U.S. playing a leading role in governing AI on the international stage. And you know, if we think about how are we going to maximize the benefits of artificial intelligence for the largest number of people, I would really like to see the United States and other sort of similarly minded, democratically aligned governments leading that conversation rather than reacting to it.
So we just heard Keith mention that the United Arab Emirates has a technology council. The U.S. doesn't have one, right? Is that something we should put together? Would that push this forward in a meaningful way, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have the answer on exactly what the right organization is inside government to do this. There are lots of people smarter than I that are thinking about it. I do think that we are still collectively working through those questions, though. So, you know, I think great that there are people in the White House. You heard from Ann Neuberger earlier today. We've got Ben Buchanan, others who are thinking about these issues all day, every day. I think that's a really good and positive step. We are really enthusiastic about the USAI Safety Institute and some of the work that they're doing to push the science of evaluating frontier models for safety. But the question of how do we bring all of the kind of composite pieces together, I don't know that we've totally solved that yet.
So we've talked about all these players around the world. But we're mostly going to talk about the US and China. So back to chips for just a minute. The US has put restrictions on chip exports to China. We've tried to limit their access to manufacturing equipment. Is it working or is it backfiring, Chris?
Well, I think the news last week was that Huawei was using a shell company not to produce domestically, but to produce in Taiwan, which I think is a pretty strong signal from Huawei about where they think the most advanced shipping capabilities are. If you look at Huawei itself, it's clearly supply constrained in terms of its ability to produce GPUs domestically. It's also supply constrained when it comes to producing smartphone chips domestically. And I think any model that I've seen based on data that we have of China's production of leading edge chips over the next 5 years suggests that China's behind now, and it probably falls further behind over the next couple of years. And that is exactly why, if you look at GPU installations, US versus China, right now there's roughly twice as many servers installed in the US versus in China. Over the next couple of years, that number is going to skew very much in the US favor, especially if you look at AI accelerated servers. And this is exactly the goal of the White House when they put the export controls in place.
Keith, do you agree, or do you think this has put the Chinese chip development program on steroids?
Well, let me react first to one thing he just said a second ago, which is the number of servers. It's interesting because I think that the number of servers, and hence the number of GPUs that are in those servers, right, matters if you care about the carbon impact and you care about cost. What I mean by that is, the benefit of this technology of being really performant and really efficient only matters in a pure market context where you care about the cost because you're trying to monetize what comes out the other end, the tokens. And or you also care about the environmental impact and or the cost of the energy that goes into those chips. If neither one of those constraints exist, that is, burn as much coal as you need and spend as much money as you need because there's not a market impact here. I don't know that the number of servers matters because, in China, if it requires 2 or 3 or 4 times as many GPUs to achieve the same level of performance for whatever purpose, maybe it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure it's an apples to apples comparison if they don't have those constraints.
Can I jump in here just to maybe add, I think, and amplify your point? One of the things that we are experimenting with at OpenAI right now is scaling along time to think, right? So this is the whole theory of the case behind the O1 line of models that OpenAI has just put out. One of the implications of that is that you may actually be able to do a lot more with a model that is not as large.
That's right.
Yeah. And so that, I think, Chris, your earlier point about, the ceiling is still, it raises the ceiling for the labs that have, or the governments that have the highest amount of compute, but it also means that you can do more with less. And that has real implications, I think, for how we should be thinking about what the PRC could do with the number of chips and the level of chips that they do have access to.
Well, I think if I do understand the infrastructure needs of O1, though, it means you can do less on training but more on inference.
More
and so
on
your
inference, yeah.
time use of GPU actually grows relative to alternative metrics, which means that the amount of GPUs you have deployed at inference is still critically important.
Even less powerful chips.
Potentially less powerful chips.
Yeah.
Although
Yeah,
I think if you asked what are the types of chips that are running the O1 model, I think they wouldn't be that.
No,
old.
just saying in theory.
In theory, yes. In theory, yes.
Yeah.
Well, pursuing the energy question for just a bit longer, your former company, NVIDIA, has now developed a chip that's supposedly more energy efficient, correct? So theoretically, the energy demands become less severe?
Well, I think if I quote my former boss, he would say, the more you spend, the more you save. I think that's kind of the logic there. But I think
Explain.
Yeah.
Expand.
Well, I think we're just saying yes. As you scale as you scale more, as you build more infrastructure and scale more, you could argue that the cost goes down, right? But you can also argue that you're also potentially overshooting, right? Depending on the size of the models and the context you're going. So I don't know that that's always the only answer to the question. I cut out during lunch to go to MIT because there's a startup there that I'm working with called Liquid AI. And Liquid basically are the genius grad students who came out of the CSAL lab who invented this new architecture that can essentially deliver a model for 20 to 200 times less compute power. So the data science alone, the architecture of the models alone can drive down the computing needs. So I guess the construct that policy is driven by, if we prevent, if we prevent our competitors from accessing from our biggest chips, then that will slow them down. I think the point I'm making, maybe that Sasha's making, is that that's only true if data, to the extent that data science stands still, and that's not actually what's happening. Data science itself is also evolving. The AI architectures are evolving, and increasingly they're evolving towards smaller models that need less compute in certain contexts. So it isn't a very black and white situation.
So huge investment by the U.S. to try and build more chips here. Is it working? Can we build these fabs fast enough? Can we scale them up, get them operating?
Well, I'd say Taiwan's TSMC announced about a month ago that 99% of the world's GPUs are produced at TSMC. An extraordinary concentration in really any industry in all of human history, that the primary driver of technological progress depends on 2 factories. Hard to imagine in basically any other sphere. We're going to start to see, I think, at some point, moderate GPU production in Arizona at the TSMC facility there. But
Yeah.
I guess my assumption, and I think this is in line with industry, is that the vast majority of GPUs are produced in Taiwan for a long time to come.
I would agree.
Sasha, how worried should we be about that, given tensions over Taiwan?
Look, I mean, I think we should be worried about concentration of any kind of a scarce resource writ large. I mean, there was also some reporting as a result of the recent hurricanes about some of I think it's silica factories that are based in North Carolina
That's
that were
right.
impacted. And when we
They
think
came
about
back online very quickly.
the fragility of our supply chain, though, is something I think the government ought to be concerned about. And that's not a statement about the relative risk of Taiwan versus any other location. But I do think if one thing we learned from the pandemic is we need to think about redundancy and resiliency in critical areas.
Yeah.
So you just put that in a way that made me sit up. We ought to be concerned about supply chains. Aren't we concerned about supply chains?
Yes, I think.
Phew.
I think certainly I am.
But if you look empirically at the biggest U.S. firms and ask how concerned are they really, and then look at how they deploy their dollars as a metric for answering that question, you'll find that of the 10 largest firms in the U.S. by market capitalization, none of them have deployed a tiny share of their procurement dollars to actually change the locations of supply chains.
Wow.
Well, but what I would say is that there is definitely hope that not just TSMC in the U.S., but also Samsung in South Korea and Rapidus in Japan. I mean, there are some glimmers of hope that there are options, but if you were to add them all up, and in the best case scenario, they all went online in the near future, the geopolitical impact would be approximately 0 in the next 5 years because of the sheer dominance of TSMC. It's still the right thing to do, but I don't know that it'll make a difference.
So what if China moves against Taiwan? Will it be catastrophic for us in terms of AI because of what's coming out
I
of it?
think that question's been asked and answered.
Well, do it again for me,
There's
but
no,
more colorfully.
I mean,
Yes.
let me offer a perspective from my prior role in government at the Pentagon. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the corresponding sanctions against the Russian government, we had a number of conversations with variety of companies across a variety of industries, and the kind of consistent feedback we heard was, look, we can do this. Like we can adapt our processes to work around the sort of U.S.-Russia tension, because either our business, our market in Russia wasn't that big, or our supply chain, we have workarounds or what have you. It was hard, and it required some thought, and it required some time for them to adapt. But at the end of the day, they basically did. And what we heard from them, though, is if we had to do this with China, it would be existential for us, and over and over and over again. So it's not, yes, we are here to talk about AI, and we're here to talk about the implications for AI, but the economic impact of a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan would be far more vast than just the impact on artificial intelligence industry.
Keith, we just heard Russia mentioned. When you were going through your many countries that have an oar in the water when it comes to AI, is Russia one of them? What are they doing?
I have no idea what Russia's doing.
Ooh.
I don't have any personal visibility into Russia. So.
Sasha, do you know, as someone who's been in the defense establishment?
Look, I mean, I think they have ambition, and I think that ambition is largely not been realized. I think my experience over the past couple of years has taught me it's probably not prudent to ever count the Russians out, but I think they've got a gap that they would really need to make up if they were serious about making a play in this space. And Putin has said he wants to, so we'll see, but I don't see it right now.
Chris, I'm wondering about workforce challenges when it comes to manufacturing here in the US. How serious are they? And will they stymie our efforts in AI?
I think workforce challenges are serious in the manufacturing side. Maybe to start, I think if you look around the world, they're severe actually everywhere. Samsung just had employees go on strike. I didn't know they allowed that in South Korea, but apparently they do. If you go to Taiwan, you'll hear about the desire to import workers from across Southeast Asia. So yes, there are workforce challenges, but I think that's actually a global trend. And if you talk to people who are building chip-making facilities in the US and ask them, what's your primary workforce challenge? They'll say welders, specialty welders who have worked in chip-making facilities before. That's the type of labor we need right now. I think if you look at the rest of the AI supply chain, and particularly the application of AI, you'd have to say the US is probably the best place of anyone in the world to already have in place the types of expertise that you need to deploy AI. And that's an optimistic story, I think.
I think that the skill set that's not talked about a lot, everything Chris said is true, and the skill set that's not talked a lot about is the actual hands-on experience of scaling these large computing clusters not just designing them back at NVIDIA or AMD or Intel, not just the engineering part, the design part, but the actually running of these large-scale clusters, the experience of operating a high-performance computer. There are far fewer people in the world that do that than do AI, right? I mean, it is literally less than 1,000 people in the world that have that kind of, and probably if we're talking about expert levels, people that are in a managerial position that can truly lead, that like whoever's working for Elon in Memphis at his big data center there, or I mean, you're probably talking in a very low single-digit hundreds in the entire planet. And that skill set, if you don't have access to that skill set, it doesn't matter how much money you have, doesn't matter how much oil you have, doesn't matter how many data centers you have, nothing's going to happen. So those are one of the bottlenecks.
How do you build that cadre?
You build it over time. It's not built quickly. You can't microwave to that future. I mean, that is, I mean, you need to partner and you need to have, you need to fly people in. It's just, it's a hassle. You cannot get over it. And that is one of the many little sort of untalked about bottlenecks in scaling this future.
Sasha, anything on workforce?
No, I think these guys have well covered it.
I will say that I recently did a panel discussion with some people from the energy sector relative to AI, and they were saying, yeah, they need the construction workers to build the plants. Not to mention, they need all the equipment that it'll take to build the plants, and also to upgrade the grid, which is a mess. Just doesn't have the capacity.
Just the advanced cooling systems. We're going through this step change now as AI from an infrastructure moves from server-based to rack-based. And that means instead of buying a single server, you have to buy a rack of them, and they're basically glued together. And so in order to do that, you have to completely change the power, the cooling, the weight, tolerance of the floor. I mean, it's a non-trivial upgrade. And having the skills and the technology to do that, everyone doesn't have that. And in some countries, it's not available at all. And so people, again, it's just one of the many, many bottlenecks.
So we've talked so much about AI today, and usually the way it's been framed is, what a growth opportunity. This is fantastic. Are these things we're talking about, these bottlenecks, whether we're talking about chips or we're talking about workforce or we're talking about limitations in our electrical infrastructure, are those going to limit our progress in AI?
Yeah, I mean, well, bottlenecks are never helpful, but in capitalist terms, bottlenecks are opportunities. Right, and so you see these big partnerships brewing, Blackstone and BlackRock and others leaning in with tens to hundreds of billions of dollars just for that reason, right? Capitalizing on these opportunities by investing in those ecosystems and buying up extra capacity. So I mean, yeah, it's a hassle, but I think the net result will be that they'll be unlocked through investment and innovation, and that's a good thing.
But I do think that government has a role to play here in setting the environment and making it possible for the things that Keith is describing to happen. And you think back to like other periods of history where we were adopting new technologies at scale. Think about the railroads in the 19th century or electricity in the 20th century. There have to be some capital investments that get made on the part of the government as well if you want the access to be broad-based.
And government claims to be making some of those investments through CHIPS Act, for example. They doing enough?
It's a start. I think is the diplomatic way to answer that
But
question.
not enough is what you're telling me.
Well, look, I mean, Sam Altman, who's OpenAI CEO, often says there are sort of three things you need to get right in order to do this. You need compute, you need energy, and you need human will. And those are the three legs of the stool that we are focused on. I think we bring a lot of will to the equation, but we can't solve the other two legs alone.
What about money? Doesn't it take money too?
I think the stock market has shown it's willing to pour all the money that's necessary into AI.
You guys are in the private sector. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, again, if we look, going back to our little conversation before in the green room about inclusivity, it's true in the West. I mean, I think startups in the West raised like 30 billion this year. I mean, big numbers, right? Big numbers. And the infrastructure investments from big tech were like north of 100 billion, huge numbers. But if you look on a global scale, and if you're going to take off all the blinders, that's only happening in a handful of countries. I mean, of the 190 or so countries in the world, only 34 have a supercomputer. Most of those computers sit in 2 countries. The rest of the computers, that's like half the world's computers. The other half sit in 32 other countries. And then there's 160 countries that can't compute a large-scale model. So that's 160 countries that will be net importers of AI from the rest of the world. So to me, and what I see is a mad rush by these smaller countries. Some want to buy computers for sure. Others are also really, really focused on growing their local AI ecosystem, creating some unicorns, training people, just so that they don't fall off the map in this sort of new AI-driven economy, which is possible. And I think that AI divide is going to get wider and wider.
And go ahead.
Well, I think Keith is right, and I think if you're thinking about foreign policy implications for the U.S., this is a real opportunity to really set the rules around the infrastructure right now. There's a whole new rebuild of digital infrastructure happening at this moment. And this is something that we haven't really done since maybe the fiber build-out 20 years ago. And it looks like it'll be U.S. firms playing a really critical role, not just in North America or in Europe or in Japan, but also in Africa, in the Middle East, really everywhere outside the world except for China, and maybe you'd say Southeast Asia where there's some Chinese competition. And so thinking strategically about what do you want to get out of this moment, I think is actually quite important for us right now.
And are we jumping on that opportunity?
I think we are. I think you'd say the benefit the U.S. has is that it's only U.S. firms in the lead, and so that's given the U.S. government time to think through what its strategy is going to be. It's easier to compete when you don't have any competitors.
But what we
I'm thinking
often,
of the Chinese Belt and Road, though, and how effective that has been, not in the AI space, but elsewhere. And the U.S. was flat-footed.
Yeah.
In that.
I think the difference right now is that you can listen to our friends in the Middle East say, well, if you don't give us the infrastructure we need, we'll go to China. But the reality is China is smuggling in GPUs via suitcases. And so there really isn't an alternative in the short run. In the long run, perhaps, but for the next couple of years, I think the dominant expectation across the private sector is that the key providers of the hardware that you need to build AI training or AI infrastructure, AI inference infrastructure is going to be U.S. providers. And so that gives us a whole lot of space to set the rules.
Sasha.
I agree with Chris entirely. I was just going to say, though, that what we do with that lead is what matters, right? Because it's not inevitable that we'll have it forever. I mean, I tend to like our chances, but we just don't know. And the rate of progress in the technology is such that, what I often say when I go back in and talk to my, former government colleagues is we in government are still thinking with a calendar, and we need to be looking at a clock, right? This is just moving much faster than, and that's not a critique necessarily of the U.S. government. I think then governments writ large are prepared to address. And so, I think it will be really important for the next administration in the United States to have to feel a sense of urgency about how they're going to address some of these challenges that we're talking about up here today.
Yeah, I also just want to dovetail off what you said, because we're at this turning point, right? And there's $1 trillion in infrastructure that has to be upgraded. Most of it will be upgraded with U.S. design technology. I feel like the majority of the public policy effort on this front is towards restricting the sale of the technology, not incentivizing the adoption of it towards good purposes or whatever. So, we're involved, but we're focused mostly on who not to sell it to and how to account that. The one program that I've seen that's very positive on the other side is the State Department has this program, or at least had this program last year, called the Connections, U.S. Connections. State Department with AI Connections? I don't know. Anyway, but it wasn't a big grant, but it was a great program to go around to developing countries in the regions you outlined, to engage with them, to talk about U.S. approaches to AI governance, U.S., all the different ways that, to influence their infrastructure investments and the way they manage everything from data to computer science. But it was a relatively small program, from the State Department. It's certainly not a Belt and Roads scale, commitment.
I think one of the interesting nuances, dilemmas, is that you're talking about selling infrastructure to the Europeans or the Japanese. That's straightforward. In the rest of the world, it's obvious that AI will be used for economic purposes, for research purposes, for surveillance purposes, for all sorts of other purposes. And it was interesting, Tarun Chhabra, who works on these issues at the NSC, made a public comment about a month ago talking about how do you think through the implications of selling your technology to a country that will use it for both good purposes and potentially nefarious purposes. And that's a really interesting balance to think through. And we think about setting the norms. There's norms in terms of access. There's norms in terms of the energy mix you use to power your infrastructure. But there are also norms on these types of issues, too. And so it's not just a U.S.-China competition. It's also in whose hands do you want to put this technology and what rules do you put around it?
Are your companies wrestling with those questions?
Absolutely. And in fact, we have pretty strict usage guidelines for exactly the kinds of reasons that Chris is describing, because we don't want to see our technologies used for purposes that we think are not consistent with our mission. And so, we look at the sort of the record of the country, their human rights record, their record of sort of adhering to international law. We also look at the specific use cases to make sure that it's something that we as a company feel that we can stand behind.
Have there been cases where you haven't made a sale because you
Absolutely.
haven't come up with the answers you would have been happy with?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's the very reason that they do that has also, to be honest, in part driven some of the sovereign AI activity. When ChatGPT first came out, I mean, you weren't there yet, but when ChatGPT first came out, not everyone knows this, but 32 countries weren't allowed to touch the API. There was a decision made for those reasons that, this country and that country can't use it. That immediately led to those countries saying, oh, that's fine, we'll create our own. So the very genesis of sovereign AI was in part due to the reaction to the limitations on the API, because the reaction is, well, this seems like a pretty important technology. I don't think we want to be dependent on a foreign company or country for it. And so inevitably, it's a complex place to be as a commercial company, because you want to respect the values and international norms, but then other people, that's fine, I just won't use it. And it's a balancing act.
We've heard people contend that China's progress in AI may be constrained by the fact that they have some limitations on what can be used and how it can be used and so forth. Keith, you're nodding. Do you think that's a serious impediment to China's development of AI or not?
I don't know. I mean, I will say that China released rules on how to use generative AI before we did, right? They were among the first countries to do that, but those rules only applied to the private sector. Doesn't apply to the government.
It's the government sector.
I think the interesting data point from the last couple of years is if you look at big U.S. tech firms, Meta, Microsoft, et cetera, their spending on AI infrastructure since ChatGPT was released has boomed. Yeah. Look at big Chinese tech firms, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, the publicly listed ones for whom we have reliable information, and ask what has their capital expenditure trend been over the last 2 years. There's no obvious trend. They're not investing more than they were before. And if you think, well, why not? Maybe it's because they think they're behind. I'm not sure that's true. I think it's mostly because President Xi spent the last 5 years beating up on his most successful tech firms. And so, would you invest while Jack Ma lives in Tokyo? It just doesn't make any sense. So I think that's the other aspect that has really restrained the Chinese private sector.
I'd love to look forward a little bit. What's next in AI? Eric Schmidt said this morning it's going to be about apps, powerful apps. Wondering if you guys have agreed with that or have a different perspective.
I mean, I don't like to bet against Eric, but
and nor should you in this room.
Yeah, a lot of friends of Eric here.
Yes, a lot of friends of Eric in the room. I count myself among them.
Yeah.
For us, I think it's agentic systems, right? I mean, these
It's
are
what? I'm sorry.
agentic systems. So
Explain
AI
to me
models
non-techie.
that
Agents.
are capable of taking action on your behalf in the real world. And that could be anything from it, books your plane ticket and it knows that if your plane is delayed, you need a hotel room, and so it goes ahead and books that too. You set the parameters, you set the permissions, and then it goes off and acts as your agent in the world. That's a kind of commercially viable use case, but then there's everything all the way up to, you could imagine AI agents that are doing work in a wet lab on biologic research, and so I think that is what's coming next. It's coming right around the corner. You just saw Anthropic announced, I can't remember if it was this week or last week, that they are working on a computer use agent, so a kind of KUA model,
Yeah.
and I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the agentic AI is huge. I mean, everyone agrees that's the next natural progression of AI, from chatbots and having sort of conversational engagement to action. But I also think it's just this impossible question you're asking. I mean, I'm on the National AI Advisory Committee, and when that kicked off in 2022, there was no ChatGPT publicly yet. No one knew about it. And so, we got together and we launched this committee, under Secretary Raimondo, and we decided what we're going to focus on all year. And then 6 months later, ChatGPT comes out. We're like, our work is going to be useless. I mean, if we don't pivot right now to focus on Gen AI a little bit, we're going to turn a report in the end of the year and be useless. And so it's practically impossible to know what's coming around the corner. So I think everyone agrees agentic AI is huge and it's happening. I also think the sort of physical AI, the bringing AI into the physical world through robotics, which has been the dream of every small child since the 70s, 60s. I think, robots are definitely coming. I mean, we are entering the age of humanoid robotics. I mean, you're going to see these are going to happen. And that requires a step level of sophistication in the foundation models, the ability to engage with the real world, the physical world in 3D, not just to talk, not just language, but the visual perception all in is orders of magnitude more complex. So there's teams all over the world working on that next generation foundation model for robotics. So what's coming is mind-blowing, right? So for our children, our children's children. But I think we're all in the right place.
Chris?
Well, I think if I knew the answer, I'd probably work for AMD rather than be an
Well, who knows,
academic.
you might
but
in another year.
I mean, I guess my mental model is that the internet was just invented and it's 1994, and we're looking at the internet via Alta Vista, and there's a whole lot of change yet to come. And I think it's worth remembering just how long it took for Google and Facebook to be founded after the internet, to think about all the innovation that will be down the road. And I think that's what's exciting about it, is that there is so much change and the speed is happening just so rapidly.
A lot of talk here today, again, about public-private partnership.
Yeah.
Sasha, is there enough?
No, and I say that as someone both who's seen it from the government side and from the industry side.
Yeah.
And I look, I think we as a company, I can't really speak for OpenAI as a company, but the internal vibe is very much that we want to have a deeper and sort of more bilateral partnership with the U.S. government and with other key governments around the world. Because we can't do this all ourselves. And you think about something even like the work of the safety evaluations, is something I'm working on quite intensively right now. There is expertise that is resident inside the government about threat intelligence, about the ways in which bad actors might try to use our products or our models to do things that we wouldn't want to see them do, that we don't have as a company. And so we need to have that back and forth and that deeper partnership. There's no real model, though, that we can find in sort of looking in historical precedent that is exactly analogous to where we are right now, where you have the vast majority of the sort of technological advances happening in the private sector. And is it the Manhattan Project? Is it something that looks a little bit more like the space race? We've thought about all of these models, and they all work a little bit, but none of them are a complete match. And so I think we're going to have to invent this for ourselves. And I know there are a lot of conversations happening about that in this room, in other forums, and I think we're excited to see where that goes.
Keith, do you want to weigh in, or Chris?
I mean, the public-private partnerships are the only way forward, and we don't have enough in the U.S. I agree. I was wearing a little bracelet here that I got this morning from the Massachusetts team. I met with the Massachusetts AI Strategic Task Force this morning, which hosted by the governor's team, and it was almost all, maybe 10% of the room was public sector, the other 90% was private sector. And I applauded them for that, because I mean that is the future. And I can tell you overseas, you know, when people talk about sovereign AI, what that really is that's really the government leaning into recognizing the importance of AI and then catalyzing the private sector to do stuff. It's almost exclusively, not exclusively, but almost exclusively driven by the private sector in most countries. And so, or it's really not possible without them. We need more of that here. I mean, there's very important, very real separation between governments and private sector, that's fine. But if we don't lean in together, you know, especially on national security, then it's very hard to compete.
Chris, what about the academic sector?
Well, I think education is one of the spheres where there needs to be a lot more work. There's an extraordinary book just published by an author named Jeff Ding on technological diffusion across societies. And so he charted how there's many instances where technology is invented in one place, but it actually diffuses more rapidly in a different country.
Right.
Because the things that make great inventors doesn't necessarily make great appliers of technology. And education is one of those key variables that determines your diffusion rate. And I do think we're relatively well placed, but I think there's also a lot of work that can be done to encourage both younger generations to embrace tools, but also get older generations to embrace tools. That's actually what I worry more about, that the median age in a typical organization is at an age where they're going to be resistant to AI rather than embracing it. And I think the more we can do to get people who are the primary factor slowing down technological progress is people's willingness to adopt new technologies. If we can get people more comfortable embracing AI, we'll have a much more rapid diffusion process.
So we have some students in the room here. I'd love each of you to drop a few pearls of wisdom to them about what they might pursue or might not. Chris, since you're in academia, do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess I've heard lots of people over the last couple of years argue, given that we're in an era of AI, surely you must study only AI. And I guess I've been struck by the extent to which I think we're going to need all of the other disciplines to make sense of AI's application. Economics, I think history, being a historian, is naturally very important. Political science, many, many others. And so the ability to bring together understanding of what AI is and how it'll be deployed with other disciplines seems to me to be really centrally important.
Well, I'm going to pull from Henry Kissinger, who's very important to this organization and obviously played the founding role for the Strategic Competitive Studies Group, and he passed away recently. But he was famously quoted, or at least famous to me, when he was quoted 2 years ago, I think, when someone asked him, at his, sort of at his age, how is it that he's getting involved in AI at 100 years old, and he said, well, there are people that understand the AI, they understand the technology, and there's people that understand the implications of the technology. And I understand the implications of the technology. And I think that that's a very simplified way to think about it, because I'm not a STEM student. I'm not an engineer. I don't study data science. In fact, I went to law school and did all sorts of things.
But we let you in the room anyway.
Yeah, they let me anyway. But there's a lot of career paths around AI that aren't related to just being an engineer. And so if you understand the implications of the technology, then you can be very useful from governing it, to selling it, to shaping the design around it, to all these other things.
Sasha?
Well, I'll co-sign the not a STEM student. I mean, I spend a lot of time with our researchers in San Francisco, and I find that I have to say to them, like, I'm going to repeat back to you what I think you just said to me in English, and then you're going to tell me if I got it right or if I oversimplified it too much. Look, a question I get asked a lot these days, by virtue of where I am in my professional journey, is from students, where should I go to make the biggest difference? Do I go into government? Do I go into the private sector? How do I think about balancing those two things? And my answer is there's no right answer. And I actually think a lot about my former boss, who this conference is named after, Ash Carter, and we've got the Carters here. He devoted his life to building bridges between technology and government and private sector and government. And I was really honored and privileged to work on that project with and for him. And I think we need more of that. So we need people who have industry experience, who have technical skills, who are willing to take time and go into government and share their expertise and share their perspective. And likewise, we need people like me who spent most of my career in government, going, in the opposite direction to say, well, here's how the government's probably going to think about that and why they're raising the kinds of concerns that they're raising. And if we don't have that back and forth, we're missing kind of a crucial thread in this fabric of innovation that our country has so expertly been able to capitalize on. So there is no right path as long as you're doing things that are consistent with your values and that you're passionate about.
Perfect place to end. Sasha Baker, Keith Stryer, and Chris Miller. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
All right.